This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Atelia Edwards. Tonight's top stories. Another day brings another wave of attacks in the Israel-Iran conflict. Tehran's UN ambassador accuses Israel of targeting populated areas. A South Korean President Lee Jae-myung says that his country and Japan are inseparable as he wraps up his first major international engagement at the G7 summit. Buckle up for takeoff. Central Asian countries agree to increase flights to and from China, where Beijing will simplify visa procedures for the former Soviet countries. And China's central bank governor lays out a vision of a new global currency order, where several currencies, rather than just one, dominate the system. Coming up, we speak to the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, Gita Gopinath, on China's economic recovery, other East Asian economies, and the impact of Middle East tensions.
The impact should be fairly contained for the world, but a lot depends upon the scale of this conflict and whether it becomes a broader conflict, in which case, of course, the consequences could be much more severe.
Also in East Asia tonight, China successfully carries out an escape flight test of its next generation Mengzhou spacecraft, laying the groundwork for a manned mission to the moon. Iran promising serious retaliation after Israeli forces conducted overnight attacks on centrifuge and weapons production sites in the capital, Tehran. A supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, vows that his country will show no mercy towards Israel's leaders as the conflict rages on. Well, the IDF says the more than 50 Israeli fighter jets that were deployed struck around 20 targets in Tehran. Iranian news websites say Israeli forces also attacked the Korea missile production facility. Israel says the latest wave of attacks is part of an extensive effort to damage Iran's nuclear weapons development program. Tehran responded by firing hypersonic missiles at Israel. Israel says that one of its drones crashed in Iran after being shot by a surface-to-air missile. Well, this follows reports by Iran state broadcaster IRIB, which showed apparent wreckage from the Israeli Hermes drone in the city of Isfahan. Meanwhile, the U.S. says it will be closing its embassy in Jerusalem until Friday. Washington has also directed American government employees and their family members to take shelter until further notice. Well, the measures come amid mounting speculation about possible U.S. intervention. China, Japan and South Korea have started evacuating their nationals in Iran and Israel as attacks between the two foes enter their sixth day. China's foreign ministry announced today that almost 800 Chinese nationals from Iran and Israel had been evacuated to safer places, while more than 1,000 were in the process of relocation. Now, the Japanese embassy in Tehran says it may evacuate citizens as early as Thursday. Broadcaster Fuji Television Network revealed Tokyo's intention to send a military plane to Djibouti as part of its efforts to evacuate Japanese nationals from both Iran and Israel. Now, South Korea's foreign ministry called on its citizens to leave both Iran and Israel and warned nationals planning travel to either the Middle East nation to cancel or postpone their trips. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiekun expressed Beijing's gratitude to the nations that helped with the evacuation process. All right, for more, Trent Murray, he joins us live now from Tel Aviv. Now, Trent, the two sides have been exchanging near-daily crossfires. What is at stake at this point of the conflict?
Well, day 6 of this war, and I think both the rhetoric and what we're seeing on the ground suggests that both sides continue to climb the escalation ladder, bringing the risk of this region being drawn out into a much longer all-out war. As we heard, in your introduction, we saw here in Israel yet another wave of Iranian ballistic missile attacks in the early hours of this morning. The IDF is saying around 10 missiles were fired towards Tel Aviv. They were all largely able to be intercepted, and we don't have any reports of injuries or casualties on the ground. The number here is significant because it does appear, based on what we are seeing, that the numbers of Iranian missiles are reducing. Certainly Friday, Saturday and into Sunday we were seeing hundreds of them, but now it is a handful. Some military analysts here are starting to question whether perhaps Iran's missile numbers are being depleted and also whether their launches are falling in number based on those IDF attacks. But what we have heard as well is that the Israelis are showing no sign of slowing down with their air operations over Iran. Heavy bombing reported in Tehran over the past few hours, with the Israelis saying they are targeting that nuclear centrifuge manufacturing facility, sort of a key piece in the puzzle of the manufacturing line for Iran's nuclear program. But as you also said, the Iranians saying, and in particular the Ayatollah, that they are going to attack Israel without restraint. So I'm not seeing any sort of off-ramp from where we are standing right now. The state of emergency, of course, still remains in place here in Israel, but we did see for the first time since this conflict began one commercial airliner land here. It was an El Al flight, a specially chartered one, bringing Israelis back home from the neighbouring island of Cyprus. But of course, for foreign nationals here, there is still no way out via the air. The advice right now, including from China's embassy, is for their nationals to leave via the land border crossings into Jordan.
So, Trent, I can't help but notice President Trump's increasingly hawkish stance towards Iran. What do we make of that?
Well, it's an incredible shift of tone, isn't it? I mean, last week we were hearing President Trump still openly discussing wanting to sit down with the Iranians and negotiate a deal through to last night now, where he's openly calling for them to surrender entirely. And what we know is that that rhetoric appears to be being backed up by some pretty significant military manoeuvres. Dozens of US aircraft are being flown from the US here to the region, including refueling aircraft, the types of planes that you need in order to refuel fighter jets to carry out air operations. We also are seeing satellite imagery, including in Bahrain, where key US Navy ports seem to be dispersing their ships away from those ports out into the sea. That comes, of course, as the Iranians are openly saying that if the US does join this campaign and starts attacking Iran, then they will start targeting some of the US troops in this region. And they are here in big numbers, around 40,000 US soldiers at bases, including in Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE and others. So right now, as I say, I think the stakes are climbing here. The rhetoric and the threats, not just between Israel and Iran, are growing, but also increasingly from the United States, which is why many in this region, in particular diplomats, I think, are doing what they can to try and dial down the tensions despite the increasingly escalatory situation that we are seeing on the ground.
All right, thanks for that report. Trent Murray, live from Tel Aviv. Meantime, oil prices eased in Asian trade as Israel and Iran maintain attacks against each other. Brent trading at $75, down about 1% in today's session. WTI crude $73 per barrel, also in the red. But concerns over supply through the Strait of Hormuz, where about a fifth of the world's oil consumption passes through, still persists. Iran is the third largest producer among a coalition of oil-producing nations known as OPEC. But observers say there is enough spare capacity among OPEC members to cover it, should there be any disruptions. Well, earlier, CNA's Roland Lim spoke to IMF's first Deputy Managing Director, Gita Gopinath, and she shares her thoughts on the situation in the Middle East.
We are closely following the developments in the Middle East. I think it's a bit early to say what will happen. But as of now, the movements in oil prices have been fairly orderly. I mean, they've gone up some, but it's not been a dramatic increase in oil prices. At the levels at which they are right now, the impact should be fairly contained for the world. But a lot depends upon the scale of this conflict and whether it becomes a broader conflict, in which case, of course, the consequences could be much more severe.
And if things escalate, are there specific spillovers that Asian economies should be looking out for specifically because they are energy reliant?
So countries that import energy, obviously there is an impact of higher oil prices. It affects their energy costs. But for most Asian economies at this point, inflation is actually coming down. It's come down quite a bit. I mean, if you think of Singapore, inflation is around 1% for 2025 is what we project. So at least in terms of the trajectory for inflation, I think most Asian countries are better placed to handle an external event that drives energy prices up.
We'll have more insights into the Israel-Iran conflict, including what's at stake for China and how it could play a part in de-escalating the situation. We'll be speaking with Aina Tangen later this hour on East Asia Tonight. He's a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. The G7 summit in Canada has ended, with the leaders agreeing to new sanctions against Russia over the war in Ukraine. It was a rare show of unity during a summit marked by differences and U.S. President Donald Trump's early departure. Well, the Middle East crisis between Israel and Iran also became a dominant issue and point of contention. Nick Harper with this report.
This was a summit that was largely overshadowed by the tensions in the Middle East. Its agenda was upended by the conflict between Iran and Israel. And it was a summit where one of the G7 leaders left halfway through. Donald Trump abruptly departed at the end of day one, which perhaps speaks to the major challenge facing this grouping. Unity. They struggled with it on a variety of different issues. They managed to find some consensus when it came to the situation evolving between Iran and Israel. They put out a joint statement on Monday calling for de-escalation. But then Donald Trump on Tuesday spent much of the day seeming to entertain the idea of joining Israel in its aerial bombardment of Iran. On Ukraine, they managed to agree to a range of new sanctions against Russia, but Donald Trump was causing problems by saying it was a mistake that Russia was no longer part of the grouping. Russia was kicked out in 2014 after it annexed Crimea. And then, when it came to the meetings, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, said that they were highly productive, but pointed out that this was just the beginning rather than the end of their work. But he also hinted at the challenges that the grouping had been facing when they were confronting issues around the world, but also the challenges facing them around their negotiating table.
Over the past days, also met with global leaders who will help determine what is success in the new global system that will emerge over time. And underpinning each of those discussions was, I stress, Canada's readiness to work to create new international partnerships to promote a world that's more secure, prosperous, just, and free. We're looking to deepen alliances with stable democracies who share our interests, our values, our principles.
There was no joint communique at the end of the summit detailing everything they agreed on. Instead, the chair, Canada, put out statements on 6 issues that were discussed, including critical minerals, transnational repression, migrant smuggling, battling wildfires, AI and quantum technologies. There was clearly a difficult meeting between Mark Carney and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. 2 years ago, Canada accused India of carrying out an assassination of a Sikh separatist on Canadian soil. That meeting, amid rocky relations, Mark Carney described as important, foundational and a necessary first step to rebuild a relationship. All of these nations will now head to The Hague next week for the NATO summit, where they will be looking at the issue of the war in Ukraine at a time when Mark Carney said multilateralism is under great strain. Nick Harper, CNA, Banff, Canada.
Meantime, on the sidelines of the G7 summit, the leaders of Japan and South Korea vowed to deepen their relationship and work more closely with the U.S. to tackle regional issues, including North Korea. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba met newly elected South Korean President Lee Jae-myung for the first time and held a half-hour meeting. Ties between Tokyo and Seoul have often been strained owing to historical disputes stemming from Japan's colonial rule. But the U.S. wants the two sides to cooperate more closely to confront regional challenges such as North Korea's nuclear threat and rising competition from China. Mr. Lee says that Seoul's cooperation with Tokyo would be of great benefit to both countries, likening it to neighbors who share the same front yard with ties that cannot be easily separated. Mr. Lee's remarks are a departure from his stance before he was elected president. He was harshly critical of efforts by his predecessor, Yoon Suk-yeol, to mend ties with Japan. Mr. Ishiba, meantime, hailed the 60th anniversary of the normalization of diplomatic relations.
国民同士の交流もこの60周年を機に さらに盛んになり、日韓の連携協力が地域のために世界のために非常に大きな力となりますことを心に期待いたしております。
Well, separately, Mr. Ishiba spoke with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, promising Tokyo's continued support in conjunction with measures by G7 countries to help Kyiv achieve a fair and lasting peace. The two leaders met face-to-face for the first time and discussed a whole range of issues, including cooperation in the defense industry and what they see as a common threat, that is, Russia's military collaboration with North Korea. Mr. Zelensky said later on social media that he is grateful to Japan and the Japanese people for their support, and that both sides see eye to eye on most issues. Well, US, Japan and South Korea held a joint air drill today. It's the first under new South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. Seoul said that the exercise was held off the coast of Jeju Island, and it involved 2 fighter jets from South Korea, 2 from Japan and half a dozen from the US. The exercise comes one day after North Korea promised thousands of troops to Russia's war effort in Ukraine, a move Tokyo and Seoul have condemned. Now, the South Korean Air Force said that the drills will strengthen the 3 countries' security cooperation in the face of threats from North Korea. Now, it also said that these trilateral drills will continue on the back of a firm US-South Korea alliance. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, IMF's Gita Gopinath discusses with CNA's Roland Lim and China's economic recovery. Other East Asian economies. Details up next. Hello again, you're watching East Asia Tonight, and it is now time for your business news update with Henry Yin. So, Henry, I believe China is talking about all this digital yuan in its push for a multipolar currency system. What's that all about?
Yes, indeed, Oteli. Now, Beijing is accelerating efforts to develop a financial system less dependent on Western institutions. It's moving against a backdrop of eroding greenback value as investors eye the mounting U.S. national debt and worry about Washington's chaotic rollout of tariffs. The central bank chief is pledging to enlarge the use of the digital yuan as well as a more multipolar forex system. Governor Pan Gongsheng was speaking at the Lujiazui Forum in Shanghai today, a key gathering of China's financial industry executives and regulators. And for more, CNA's Tan Yuguan joins us live from Shanghai. Yuguan, what measures is Beijing proposing for expanding the use of the digital yuan?
Well, in his speech, Mr. Pan is pledging to establish an international operations center for the digital renminbi in Shanghai. That pledge is actually part of 8 policy measures that he announced to build Shanghai up as an international financial center. An international operations center for the digital yuan was number 2 on that list. Other measures on that list of 8 include, number 1, establishing an interbank market transaction reporting repository to collect and analyze transaction data from different financial submarkets such as the interbank bonds, golds, etc. And number 3 on that list was establishing a personal credit reporting agency. Number 4, carrying out a pilot reform for integrated offshore trade financial services in the Shanghai Lingdang New Area, an area that's south of here, downtown Shanghai, that has been built as a zone for experimenting with reforms. And number 5, develop free trade offshore bonds to broaden financial options for enterprises going abroad, as well as enterprises within countries and regions taking part in the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, number 6, optimize and upgrade the functions of free trade accounts to help facilitate cross-border trade and investment. Number 7, pilot monetary policy tools in Shanghai, including blockchain, letter of credit, supporting issuance of tech innovation bonds. Last but not least, research and promote renminbi foreign exchange futures trading to better manage exchange risk. Henry?
Well, Yuguan, what's the PBOC chief's vision for a new global currency and what steps is he taking towards this?
Well, Henry, he's actually not calling for a single new global currency. Instead, he has in mind a multipolar currency system. In his speech, Mr. Pan highlighted the disadvantages of the current system dominated by a single sovereign currency. Here's what he said.
单主创货币 主权货币国自身的利益与全球公共品的输信发生矛盾时，主权货币国会更多的考虑自身的利益影响对全球公共品的提供。二是主权货币国的财政和金融监管问题，内部经济结构性矛盾的不断累积，会以金融风险的形式向全球溢出，甚至演变为国际金融危机。三是当出现地缘政治冲突、国家安全利益考量，甚至战争时，国际主导货币容易被工具化、武器化。
In classic Chinese fashion, Mr. Pan did not name the US dollar or the United States by name, but directed his barbs at the system rather than the country. In fact, before he began his critique of the current system, he highlighted the historical evolution of the international currency from the Dutch guilder to the British pound to the US dollar after the Second World War. He then criticized the current system and called for a multipolar international monetary system with coexistence of a few dominant currencies. He also mentioned having a super sovereign currency such as the International Monetary Fund's Special Drawing Right, or SDR, as the international currency. But he says while that is a better system, promoting it requires strong political consensus, which is kind of difficult in the current environment. So in the short term, he is seeking to alleviate the renminbi as a credible reserve currency among a basket of dominant currencies such as the euro. Henry?
All right, Yu Guan, thank you so much indeed for your update. CNA's Tan Yu Guan reporting live from Shanghai. The International Monetary Fund warns of multiple risks to global growth in the second half of this year after a generally resilient first half. And CNA's Roland Lim discussed the outlook with Gita Gopinath, the IMF's first deputy managing director, asking her about the dislocation created by the US President Donald Trump's trade policy.
So if you look at the U.S. effective tariff rate, it has moved around quite a bit. So at the start of this year, before the recent round of tariffs, it was 2.5%. Then April 2nd, it shot up to around 25%, which is what the highest has been in 100 years. And then recently, because of a lot of the negotiations and the pauses, we're now more in the 13% to 15% range. That's still much higher than the 2.5%, which is why it has real consequences for the world. I think countries are affected in multiple ways. The U.S. obviously is affected through both, weakening output. We downgraded growth in the U.S. Quite significantly in the last round in April. But it's not just that the growth is weakening, but because they are the countries imposing the tariff, the pass-through into inflation could be high. And we may see higher inflation in the U.S. going forward than what we have seen so far. For most other countries in the world, on the other hand, inflation, it's not an inflationary shock. It's tending to be a more disinflationary shock because of weaker demand for their economies. But again, we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. There's very high levels of uncertainty, and this high level of uncertainty affects investment. In terms of global supply chains shifting, we've seen already changes in that space over the past few years. We are seeing geopolitical considerations being a bigger factor in who trades with whom. We saw the emergence of connector countries, with countries like Vietnam, for instance. A lot of trade from China not going directly to the U.S., but going through Vietnam. But in this current environment, almost all countries are being faced with tariffs, so we're going to have to see how that changes.
China itself faces challenges beyond U.S. tariffs. Property sector strains, demographic headwinds, corporate debt overhang. How do you see these factors weighing on China's outlook?
So for China, yes, there are, in addition to the headwinds coming from the trade front, there are the domestic challenges that you mentioned. And we have downgraded growth for China. In April, we downgraded down to around 4% for this year, 2025. Again, looking ahead, especially into the medium term, our forecast for growth in China is about 3.5%. So we are seeing, as of now, an economy that is slowing down. Addressing the property market issues, addressing the finances of local governments, strengthening the finances of local governments, these are going to be critically important. There's a lot that can be done. The government is rolling out new programs to help stimulate domestic consumption, which I think is very critical, to build up consumer sentiment, which has been quite weak. All of that can help, and more that's done on that front in terms of providing a stronger social safety net so that you have more domestic demand-driven growth for China would be very helpful, not just for China, but for the world too.
South Korea's growth around 1%, Japan also about 1.2%. As they navigate weaker external demand, and in Japan's case also emerging sustainable inflation. What's your assessment of their monetary and fiscal policies so far?
Again, both countries have somewhat different issues to deal with. In the case of Japan, we finally see what could be a break away from incredibly low levels of inflation to returning durably back to the 2% inflation target. And the Bank of Japan has raised interest rates accordingly. Of course, it's important for them to watch the data and be prudent about responding. And we've seen that's exactly what they have been doing, because it's not just domestic developments, but also international developments will matter for how inflation evolves in their country. Similarly, Korea, I think it's important to be data dependent at this point, to pay close attention to what's happening to domestic demand and the forces on inflation. But I think both central banks are very well placed in dealing with this.
And that's all for Business. Otelli, back to you.
Thanks so very much for that, Henry. Okay, we're going to go for a break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, what role could China play in the Israel-Iran conflict? We'll be checking in with Aina Tangen, a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Iran promising serious retaliation after Israeli forces launched attacks on centrifuge and weapons production sites in the capital, Tehran. Leaders of Japan and South Korea vow to deepen their relationship and work closely to tackle regional issues when they met on the sidelines of the G7 summit. And Beijing looking to improve its road and railway connectivity with Central Asia with the possibility of more direct flights to and from China. The world is closely watching the fight between Israel and Iran because the conflict could draw in major powers. Well, U.S. is Israel's strongest supporter, both diplomatically and militarily, and has stood by Israel as it fought Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, all of them backed by Iran. For weeks now, Washington had been negotiating with Tehran to rein in its suspected nuclear weapons program. But days after Israel launched its attacks, President Donald Trump is calling for Iran's unconditional surrender. Now, Tehran also has powerful allies consulting on its nuclear program with Russia and China. Beijing even brokered a historic reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia back in 2023, indicating that China's stake in the Middle East has gone beyond commercial interests. Now, since the beginning of the conflict, China has called for de-escalation and dialogue, but how far is it willing to get involved? Well, for more insights, we are joined by Aina Tangen. He's a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. So good to have you again, Aina. First up, let's talk about the big picture here. How does China view this whole Israel-Iran conflict, and what does it tell us about the evolving role it has in the Middle East?
Well, Ottilie, I mean, this is very, very serious, and people are dying. This is unprovoked violation of international law. From China's perspective, there's no reason, while they were conducting negotiations, that you would have a strike of this sort and magnitude. Obviously, from the after looking at things, killing 20 generals, many scientists, etc., it's very clear that this was a bit long in the planning. And obviously, Donald Trump has tipped his hand that he said he knew about it, although he said he wasn't cooperating with it. But now that he says that there has to be unrestricted surrender, it is looking much more serious, especially as the tit-for-tat escalation occurs. People are dying. It's all going to end in the same way, and that's at the negotiating table. But unfortunately, people are going to die in between.
Well, this is a very serious situation, as you've mentioned. And in terms of China's role here, I mean, its economic interests, particularly around oil and trade, for instance, how do you think that's shaping its approach to Iran during this crisis?
Right. Iran has been part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a central piece, especially because of its location. China buys oil from them, as does India and many other countries. So it's a crucial supply network. But more importantly, in terms of the supply, they are at the Straits of Hormuz. If they block that, that would be 45% of China's imported oil. So it's very serious for them. They're also very concerned about the effect on the Belt and Road Initiative. This has been a $1 trillion 10-year program that has increased the capacity, industrial capacity of countries all along the Belt and Road. As we know from his visit to the 5 Central Asian countries, Xi Jinping is very, very interested in expanding that relationship. Signing 10 agreements with Kazakhstan, promising more aid, saying getting involved in this multi-country rail project. So China continues to think that trade is the key to peace. The United States seems to think that conflict is.
So I know, as you've mentioned, quite a lot at stake here for China. And Beijing has said this a few times that, they're pushing for de-escalation, they're pushing for dialogue. But how far do you think China will really go?
China is not looking for any kind of direct confrontation with the U.S. simply because there is no end game. If the U.S. and China go at it, that could lead to a nuclear war that could destroy literally the entire world. Right now, every country in the world, after the U.S. filed its broadside of tariffs at 180 countries, including a bunch of penguins, it was decided that you have to figure out a way to survive the next 3.5 years. But with incidents like this, it's getting harder and harder. The U.S. is isolating itself, not just from China, but from the rest of the world who looks on aghast. The U.S. is willing to back a genocide in Gaza and this kind of action in Iran, the bombings in Libya, Iraq, etc. They really think that there is perhaps no bottom. There's no moral standard. This is simply law of the jungle. Those who feel they're strong are going to take what they want. This is completely against the international order that was created post-World War II by the United States.
So I know you are based in Beijing. I'm curious to know how have the Chinese state media and the official rhetoric, how has it shaped perception on this current conflict? And does that reveal anything about Beijing's broader agenda?
Well, they're outraged. I mean, they see what's going on. They see the violence, the people who are dying, and they don't understand it. The media is trying to explain that this is something that the U.S. feels very strongly about, that they back Israel. But from the people on the street, they just don't understand why women and children are dying. For what purpose? How does this help America? And I think a lot of people in America are asking the same question, including Donald Trump's base. He's had some notable defections in the last few days. Public pundits who backed him in the past are now saying that he's going in the wrong direction with this going towards war outside the United States when he said he was going to withdraw from them and not controlling prices. Instead, he's seen a gradual rise in prices that could get even worse. So right now, the Chinese are collectively scratching their head. What is Donald Trump after? What is the end game? No one seems to know.
Yeah, so you've mentioned there's no end game here. You've said that a couple of times. But at the same time, we've also seen growing military ties, right, between China, Russia, and Iran. China continues to supply Iran with missile components, although not direct arms, though. So what are we reading into all of this?
Well, a lot of the things that China is supplying are what they call dual use. You use them in a washing machine and dryer, or some or a drone. So they're not supporting directly. It's not a situation where U.S. is supplying Israel and China is supplying Iran in some sort of indirect warfare. China has been very, very careful. They are happy to provide countries with defensive support. Remember, this was an attack by Israel on Iran, despite all the rhetoric coming out of the EU that somehow Iran is to blame for this, kind of massive attack on civilians.
All right, always good speaking with you. Thanks so very much for your insights, Ina Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute and Chairman of Asia Narratives. Beijing, meantime, is looking to improve its road and railway connectivity with Central Asian countries, with the possibility of more direct flights to and from China. Beijing will also be looking into simplifying visa procedures for the 5 former Soviet countries, which includes neighboring Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. All parties will also do a feasibility study on opening consular offices. Yesterday, Chinese President Xi Jinping signed a treaty with the Central Asian nations to deepen cooperation on issues ranging from trade to infrastructure. He's in Kazakhstan's capital, Astana, to attend the second China-Central Asia summit. Now, Beijing is seen to have made inroads into the Central Asian region through its Belt and Road Initiative, building up trade-related infrastructure such as railways. Russia, which has traditionally held sway in the region, saw its economic influence diminish in recent years. The Central Asia ties with China grow, and amid a move to diversify their trade and energy dependence away from Moscow. New Zealand is looking to boost the number of Chinese visitors to the country, with its tourism agency signing an MOU with China's Trip.com today. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon witnessed the MOU signing in Shanghai. Well, this is Mr. Luxon's first visit to China since becoming Prime Minister in 2023. On the weekend, Wellington announced a 12-month trial of visa waivers for Chinese passport holders arriving from Australia with valid Australian visas. Well, he is headed next to Beijing for meetings with Chinese leaders, including President Xi Jinping. He told reporters the two sides have a strong relationship in which trade features first.
The second piece is to make sure that China, as a major global power that has huge influence in helping address some of our global challenges, that we have good open dialogue about those issues, and we do. And so, I've sat in a number of meetings with both Premier Lee, President Xi, and I've enjoyed those interactions. I found them very constructive.
Time now for another break, but coming up in East Asia tonight, China's manned mission to the moon gets another boost after a successful escape flight test. And thousands in southern China forced to evacuate after heavy rain triggers severe flooding. China has successfully conducted an escape test of its new generation spacecraft, Mengzhou. The Chinese Space Agency calls it a major milestone in the country's ambition to land on the moon. And let's check out this video of the spacecraft lifting off in northwest China yesterday. The exercise tests the spacecraft's emergency escape system, the ultimate life-saving measure for astronauts in the event of a rocket failure at liftoff. Now, the escape engine ignited successfully. About 20 seconds later, the return capsule separated and landed after 2 minutes using an airbag cushioning system. The last time China did a similar test was in 1998 for the Shenzhou spacecraft. Chinese experts say the new rockets are much more powerful to be able to send humans to the moon, but the bigger explosive energy also makes them higher risk. A torrential rain in southern China is triggering severe floods, forcing thousands of residents to seek shelter. Floodwaters submerged more than half of the roads in Huaji County in Guangdong Province. There are also reports of widespread power and internet outages. The Shujiang River, which flows across the country, or county rather, exceeded its warning level for the third time since Sunday. Water levels in 18 provincial rivers have also surpassed warning levels. Local police and firefighters are rushing to rescue people trapped by the floodwaters. State media say that more than 78,000 residents have been affected, with more than a third forced to evacuate. Heavy rains have been battering southern China for several days now, with authorities issuing red alerts in several cities in Guangdong province. That's the highest level in China's 4-tier weather warning system. The downpours are also prompting school closures, flight delays and train cancellations. Malaysia is pushing to fast-track the ASEAN power grid, which will facilitate greater cross-border electricity trade among Southeast Asian countries. Well, this comes amid the growing need to decarbonize and ensure sustainable energy supply in the region. CNA's Melissa Goh has more from the Energy Asia conference in Kuala Lumpur.
Energy Asia.
Without grid, power cannot be distributed. We need to look into the standardization of the rules and regulation.
Whatever we do, we really need to bring our people along with us.
2, 1. Energy security and sustainability took center stage at the 3-day Energy Asia conference in Kuala Lumpur. Malaysia, as ASEAN chair, is eager to have all the bloc's members endorse a single roadmap to realize the fully interconnected grid system by 2045.
And more importantly is for this time for Malaysia championing ASEAN is to get the agreement signed by way of enhanced MOU or by way of agreement where all the member states agree. Only then we can work out interconnection. What is the best viable options?
Connecting grids will require hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure spending. Different grid standards and pricing mechanisms have slowed down integration. But Malaysia's national utility giant, TNB, said Southeast Asia is poised to be a regional hub for clean energy.
We can see that the ASEAN countries has different strength with respect to early generation. For example, Laos has a lot of hydro. Malaysia has the solar generation. So it becomes significantly important for the ASEAN country to be able to share all these resources.
In May, Vietnam, Malaysia and Singapore formed consortia to explore the feasibility of exporting renewable energy from Vietnam via a new subsea cable. Singapore's target is to import 1/3 of its energy needs, or around 6 gigawatts of low-carbon electricity by 2035. Malaysia, meanwhile, has agreed in principle to supply up to 1,000 megawatts of hydropower from Sarawak to Singapore via subsea cable.
So the only challenge right now is the undersea cable. Number one is expensive because the line. Number two, the waiting period is longer because there are only 2 vessels in the world that can do undersea cable. So the waiting period now is about 10 years.
So far, 8 of 10 ASEAN members have set net zero carbon emission targets. Malaysia said is on track to achieve net zero with 70% renewable energy in its power generation mix by 2050. This demand for renewable energy continues to surge for data centers.
Previously, it's nice to have, but now it's a must-have. Driven by the renewable energy commitment. Now that we need to take the momentum and turn that into a real, tangible action plan.
Harmonizing standards and rules and regulations is a building block towards realizing an ASEAN power grid that's necessary to ensure equitable growth in ASEAN that's set to become the 4th largest economy in the world by year 2030. Melissa Goh, CNA, Kuala Lumpur.
Time now for some headlines from media outlets in East Asia. TVBS says that Taiwan saw its highest weekly COVID-19 deaths this year, at 38. The youngest victim is a 20-year-old man who had no underlying health conditions. He received 3 shots of the COVID jab in 2022 but had not taken the latest JN1 vaccine. Korea Times says police are investigating a man who allegedly killed more than 120 dogs at a dog farm with an electric stun device. Investigators are looking into whether the dogs were slaughtered for consumption or sale. South China Morning Post reports that activist Greta Thunberg is receiving a rare wave of support from Chinese netizens. They commended the 22-year-old for trying to break Israel's maritime blockade on Gaza last week. Have you experienced the magic of the Phantom of the Opera? Well, the iconic musical takes its final bow in Singapore this Sunday at Marina Bay Sands Theatre. Before the curtain falls, CNA steps backstage to uncover some hidden details that might surprise even the most devoted fans.
Stepping into the spotlight as Christine Daae in The Phantom of the Opera is a full-circle moment for Grace Roberts, who spent years dreaming of joining the show.
Here we have the iconic chandelier that has a major part in our production, named after our incredible original director, Hal Prince, which is very subtly noted at the back of the chandelier, so the audience wouldn't necessarily see this.
This chandelier is no ordinary prop. Weighing in at 350 kilograms and adorned with glittering beads and 56 light bulbs, it commands attention every time it descends onto the stage.
Being in front of something so enormous coming at you, I mean, luckily it's not at the speed of light, so you're not actually in fear of your life. But the very first rehearsal, I still remember looking up at it and being like, I can't believe I'm in the Phantom of the Opera watching this iconic prop crash towards me. Every girl's dream.
The production boasts about 300 costumes.
Christine goes through a lot of different costumes during the show, and one of the most impressive ones is called the gala skirt. She's a heavy girl. She weighs about 20 kilos, and she's involved in a quick change on stage. One more that I think that everybody will recognize is the amazing, we like to call it the Star Princess dress. It's actually inspired by the sunset. So you can kind of see the blending there from like a blue to a pink, and then you have this gorgeous little cap sleeve and all of this detailing along the top.
For Ben Foster, who plays the Phantom, transforming into the masked figure is an art form.
The process is really difficult. It takes 2 hours, which is a really long time, but you have to have your face all cleaned and ready and prepped for all the glue. Then you have to get a bald cap put on your head, which is HD fitted.
This is actually the worst bit of the process because you can't breathe.
Need to face
It's like kind of movie ready. Quite a strange process seeing yourself go completely bald every night, and then everything sort of gets stuck to that and to your face. Everything is hand painted. Firstly, the prosthetic is prepared and hand painted, and then as soon as that goes on your head, it all gets blended in and hand painted and made more bald.
Each actor playing the Phantom also has a custom-fitted mask, unique to their features.
To wear the full get-up of the Phantom of the Opera is exhausting. It's not at all glamorous, but it's also one of the biggest and most beautiful joys of a costume that you can wear. For that night, you are the Phantom of the Opera, and it is such an iconic role, and that is a gift that I will never get over.
Now it's time for me to go and haunt the Opera House. I'll see you on stage.
The Phantom of the Opera wraps up its Singapore run this Sunday.
I hope you've enjoyed Wednesday's edition of East Asia tonight. But don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia, and look us up on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.